Hey guys, welcome back to Dude We Can Fix It. In our last video, we showed you how to rebuild your 4L60E transmission. And in this video, we're going to show you how to reinstall it. This particular one is going in this 2003 Chevy Tahoe, but this is pretty applicable to any 1993 and up 4L60E transmission. Alright, so the first thing that I like to do when either installing or removing a transmission is to jack the vehicle up and take the wheels off. You don't have to take the wheels off, but it helps. So now we're going to put some wheel chocks behind the back tires and jack up the frame. Now we'll check and make sure that this is secure in every direction. Alright, I am content. Now we'll pop the hubcaps off. We'll need a 22mm socket to remove the lug nuts. Alright, so now that we have the vehicle up in the air, we need the transmission. We're going to set the transmission on the transmission jack and get it secure. So before we reinstall the transmission, we'll go ahead and set the torque converter in. There we go. Should have at least 2 steps, sometimes 3. Just spin and push. There we go. Until it doesn't go in anymore. I think that is fully seated. Alright, now we can see that it is recessed behind the bell housing. It is set in 2 times after the initial setting it in on the spline. So make sure that this bore here, this journal, is nice and clean because that's going to slide inside of the crankshaft. And now we're ready to slide this up underneath the truck and lift it into place.
Yep.
We're about to reinstall the transmission. Now if we look on here, we can see that there's these 3 holes, one here, and one up there. Those are for your torque converter bolts, which look like this guy here. Now, you'll notice that this hole here is not circular. It's actually oblong. That hole's circular, this one's oblong. What we need to do is rotate that oblong hole. That is the first bolt that we want to start until it's over here on the passenger side in this position to where we can access the front. So now that that's in position, we'll go ahead and raise the transmission.
It's about a 4 o'clock position.
First thing that we're going to try to do is a dowel pin on the case side right there, and there's a corresponding hole on the transmission, and there's one of those on each side. So the first thing we want to do is get the transmission to sit on those dowel pins. Now as you raise this transmission into place, make sure that none of your wires are hanging up. It's very important to make sure that the dipstick is in proper position before we get the transmission in place. Otherwise, you'll have to unbolt the transmission because it's not going to be adjustable. Alright, so we have our dipstick tube up in the factory position, maybe even a little higher up, and we have it secured just with some electrical tape to hold it there in place. Very important as we're reassembling the transmission, as we get everything back together, we have 2 different kinds of bolts. Most of the bolts are like this here. It's got a stud, and then it's got a smaller 13mm nut that goes on afterwards, like that. And then we have just 2 regular bolts. These bolts go at the very bottom of the bell housing. The rest of the bolts are studs, and the studs are used for things like the dipstick tube to hold it into place. And there's a bracket for the fuel lines and electrical harness and stuff like that. So be aware of that as we're putting it together. Make sure that your dipstick tube is in the correct location. Alright, so once again, these bolts that don't have a pass-through thread like this one, there's only 2 of these and they go all the way at the bottom. So we'll go ahead and get these bolts started. Joe's gonna thread in another bolt or 2 on the other side, and then we'll snug up the first 6 bolts just with a ratchet, not all the way tight, and then we'll go and set our torque converter bolts. And all of the bell housing bolts are 15 millimeter. Before we move on any farther, we need to go ahead and set our 3 torque converter bolts to make sure that our torque converter is not binding. If it is bound up, we're going to have to take the transmission back off and make sure that the torque converter is set all the way onto all of the splines, and then reinstall it. So we don't want to go any farther than we have to before we go and check our torque converter bolts. So on these torque converter bolts, you always want to apply some Loctite, and then we'll be torquing them down to 45 foot-pounds. We are under the engine on the passenger side, looking straight over this frame rail or this frame support, and we can see the flywheel here with our oblong hole. You can take either a pry bar or a screwdriver or something like that, and you'll just pry this to where you can access it a little bit. Now we got to spin the torque converter by hand and get these holes to line up so we can start our first bolt. So there's this inspection hole right here. You're going to want to wear a glove with some good friction material on it, and you'll be able to spin the torque converter by hand through this hole to line up your holes on the torque converter to flex plate and install your torque converter bolts. At this point, if you're not able to get the torque converter to spin because it's bound up, you may need to take the transmission back off and make sure that it's seated all the way. But if this bell housing seats on here nice and flush like it is without any difficulty, chances are it's set on there right. So make sure you have a good grip and can push on the torque converter and rotate it. It's not necessarily easy, but you can see it's got these little knobs on here, and that means that it's moving. You might be able to see this. See, I just moved it. So now let's go line up our first bolt hole. Now we're ready to put our first bolt in. Uh-oh. Ha ha. Ha 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 ha. Got the first one. We'll thread it in by hand. Get it finger tight. And then you can actually grab a socket and tighten this up, but for ease of demonstration in the video, I'll tighten it up with a 15 millimeter wrench. Alright, so now that that is nice and snug, the torque converter and the flywheel will spin as one unit. We just need to rotate it around. Now remember, you're turning the whole engine now. It's going to be a little more difficult to rotate it. So this is the setup we're using to torque the torque converter bolts to 45 foot-pounds. A couple of wobble extensions on our 1/2-inch drive torque wrench. We'll feed it up over this cross member and then set it on the bolt right there. And torque it one more time. All right, that's it. Now do that for all 3 torque converter bolts, and then we'll move on to the next step. So now that we're done with the torque converter, we're going to just go ahead and remove the transmission jack, since the transmission is well supported by 6 bell housing bolts at the moment. It's going to be hard to show you while we're putting these bolts in, but so there's a bolt right here on the driver's side. We're going to get that bolt in first, and then it'll have a smaller threaded section coming out, and we'll put this bracket over that bolt and then put the 13mm nut on top of that. The bolt in the top center is up there. You can't see it on camera. This is just a blind hole here. There's no threads. And then our last bolt is over here back behind the dipstick. So with this one, we'll put the bolt in, and then we'll put the dipstick bracket on, and then we'll tighten the dipstick bracket down with the 13mm nut. Once we get these 3 bolts tightened in, we'll go ahead and set our dipstick tube in place, tighten that bracket down, and then tighten the bracket down on the fuel line bracket. So I'm using this series of extensions and this wobble socket here, and I'm going to fish in these last 3 top bolts. Alright, that's torqued. So we'll finish doing this for all of them. Alright, so I have Joe up top and I'm down here. We have our dipstick tube lubricated with a little bit of transmission fluid. So now we're ready to set our dipstick in. So move it over into place. Make sure that it sits on the bracket. Alright, push down. There we go. You see that it's on the bracket here. So we'll put our 13mm nut right on here. We'll tighten that down, and our dipstick tube is in.
Alright, so in your engine bay, your dipstick tube for your transmission line is going to come up right here behind your engine dipstick. You're going to route on the passenger side of the vehicle around your heater core water lines, and it's going to run down on the left side of all this wiring harness that's back here and all that mess. So it runs down right behind the engine. If it is not routed correctly, it will not go into the pan right. You'll have to take it out and reroute it around all this junk. And it's a lot easier to do this when the transmission is out.
So now we need to get this bracket on this bell housing bolt and then put a 13mm nut on it. This bracket holds our fuel lines and our electrical wiring in place. Should just be able to grab and wiggle this down, hopefully. Pry this up and over onto there. Now I'll get my 13mm nut and I'll get it started by hand. I'll get my scorpion tail of extensions. And there we have it. That is installed. Alright, so now we're ready to reinstall our vent hose. This one has a T on it. Yours may be different. So I'm going to route this up to the top. And I'm going to press this barb into the short section of vent hose that we have attached. So it just pops in like that. Alright, so now we're ready to plug in the neutral safety switch. We'll go ahead and reheat these connectors, get the glue nice and liquid. I'm gonna go ahead and try to get the little clip on here. This thing has a safety clip to keep it from coming undone. Kind of like that. Alright, so now we're going to reinstall the gear shift cable. We see this section here with these 2 tabs. This, right behind these tabs, is going to slide into there. Alright, so we'll set the thin section in here, and we'll push it through. Then we'll come over here, and this will simply pop on. Like that. Alright, so now we're ready to reinstall our transmission oil cooler lines. So, simply grab them and push them into the fitting. Once you hear that nice little click, wiggle it to make sure it's secure, and then do the other one. All right, wiggle it, make sure it's nice and tight. Now we'll move our little plastic cover down and over the clip. And do the same for the top one. Now we're ready to bring our wiring harness over, clip in our vehicle speed sensor, and come right over here and get this connector and push it down and connect over here. Nice satisfying click means that it's fully engaged. All right, so now we're going to lift up the exhaust and get some of these nuts started. Now this one is slightly different because you're gonna have to push that bracket up. I'll hold that. You want to get a couple nuts started on it?
Alright, two are started there.
Now we'll come to the back here, get these lined up. And we'll put these two nuts on here. So these are 18 millimeters. And the ones in the front are 15 millimeters. So we'll go ahead and tighten these the rest of the way up, and then we'll get ready to install the cross brace. So now we're going to reconnect our O2 sensors. All right, then we have another O2 sensor here. There we go. This connector goes over the frame rail. Put our safety clip in there. There we go. I think that probably clips somewhere. These little clips never really hold that well anyway. And then we have our last O2 sensor up here in the front. So we'll toss it over the frame rail right here. And we'll clip it together here. Once it's in, put your safety blue connector in. We're all done with those. Before we put our crossmember back in, we need to make sure that we have a nice transmission mount. This is what it should look like. If it doesn't look like this, or if it's in pieces, throw it away and get you a new one. You'll also notice that these two mounting holes are off-centered. These off-centered holes should be closer to the front of the vehicle, and this is held on with two 15 millimeter bolts. Now we'll take off this 15 millimeter nut. Now we're ready to install our crossmember. All right, so now that we have our new transmission mount on here, and we have our jack in place, taking the weight off of the transmission, we can go ahead and set our member in place. All right, tighten that up real tight. Alright. Good to go. Now we're ready to install the drive shaft. Alright, so now we're ready to reinstall our drive shaft. Go ahead and check your U-joints. Make sure that they move freely. You have one on this side. You have one at the other end. Check both of those. Now would be a good time to replace them if they need to be replaced. Ours are in good shape. A little bit of bearing grease, and we're going to lubricate the splines on the inside here. Now that the inside is lubricated, we get a little bit of transmission fluid and lubricate the outside. If you have any rust on here, go ahead and clean that up with some emery cloth and then lubricate it as I'm doing here. Now we're ready to install it. All right, so now we're going to slide this end of the drive shaft into the transmission here. You may have to spin it to get the splines to align correctly. We're in. Alright, now that it's in neutral, we're able to rotate this. Once you get it lined up, just pull it out of the transmission a little bit, and it'll fall right in place. There we go. We'll install our little brackets and our 11mm bolts. There we go. And now we're ready to install the starter. So now we're going to install this heat shield with these two 10mm bolts on the side of the transmission on the passenger side. They're such a small bolt.
So many quarter turns. Whenever you're going to put your starter back on, these are your wires that hook to the front of your starter, your signal wire and your hot wire. You're going to want to run those over the transmission lines here so that they don't bind up. They don't bind up, and that they are long enough to reach where you actually got to put the starter.
Joe's going to hold the starter in place. There's a tab on each side. There's a indentation here and an indentation on that side. And then on the power wire, you can see that there is a tab right here. That tab needs to go inside of one of those indentions. Alright, so now we have both of our wires on. The larger nut is a 13mm and the smaller nut is a 9/16. That is your signal wire. Now we can see that this little plate has a hole that's lined up. We'll put a 10mm screw in there. So now we're installing the first of the two starter bolts. Don't get it too snug until you have the second bolt installed. Alright, now we're going to torque them down nice and tight with a 3/8 ratchet. Alright, cool deal. Well, that's how you get your starter back in. Now we're ready to hook the battery back up. Alright, so now that we got the starter back in, we need to hook the battery back up. But we're going to go ahead and throw the tires on and set the vehicle back on the ground so that we have better access to the battery compartment. So if you don't remove the wheel chocks, whenever you lower the vehicle, it's actually going to push forward, and that causes a dangerous situation for whoever's operating the jack. So we move the wheel chocks back about a foot, and we'll slowly, hopefully, lower the vehicle. All right, so now we're going to hook the battery back up. You'll need a 5/16 wrench. There we have it. All right, so now that the transmission is fully back installed, we got the battery hooked back up and all of our wiring tidied up, we're ready to add 12 quarts of automatic transmission fluid. We get our handy dandy funnel, we'll start adding. Now we're ready to crank the vehicle up and let it idle for a few minutes to allow the transmission fluid to circulate. Alright, so after adding 12 quarts of fluid, we started the truck up immediately. And we had some fluid dripping down on each side of the transmission, and it was coming from the vent tube. So, we took the dipstick out and let it sit for about another 10-15 minutes. We started it back up, and I guess the fluid has settled to wherever it's supposed to be, and it is no longer purging out there. So I'm going to let it run for about a minute, and then I'm going to shift it through the gears, and we will check the fluid. Alright, so with the engine running and the vehicle in park, we'll go ahead and clean the dipstick, reinsert it, pull it back out to check our level. So we still have fluid pretty far up the dipstick, and it could be that there's a lot of fluid in the dipstick tube still, so we may need to let that dry for a while. So we'll take it for a short test drive and let it sit and check the fluid again. Alright, so we had a successful test drive. All the gears work, all the shifting is smooth as it should be. So when you get back to your house, leave your engine running and check your fluid level one more time. You may have to add some fluid or remove some fluid, but with the engine idling and everything nice and hot, you should be in this crosshatch area here labeled hot. So add any fluid that you need. I would definitely recommend starting with just 6 quarts after doing this full rebuild, because we added 12 and I had to take a couple quarts back out. So we had ours overfilled. So once again, do not add 12 quarts. That's only if your entire transmission is dry and also your torque converter is completely drained. The torque converter probably holds close to a gallon of fluid on its own, and ours was not completely drained, so 12 quarts does not apply. Now, if you have a brand new torque converter, you probably will need a full 12 quarts, but once again, you might want to start with 6 or 8 quarts and then slowly add, because it's easier to add fluid than it is to take it out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was very useful to you. In case you missed it, this series, this playlist, has everything from removing the 4L60 transmission, breaking it down, rebuilding it, and then reinstalling it into the vehicle. This was our test drive and everything worked out well. So if you'd like to know how to rebuild your 4L60, go ahead and check out the whole playlist. If you did, thanks for sticking it out with us, and I wish you the best of luck. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe to our channel, and check in for more videos. As always, dude, we can fix it.